Good Sabbath, everyone. So we are taking a slight detour from our series that we started in Nehemiah for a couple of different reasons. The story of Lazarus kept coming up this week, and so I felt that it was God telling me that I should be preaching on Lazarus this week. Also, I couldn't help myself but preach about the only mummy in the Bible on Halloween. So I figured, there's zombies in Matthew and there's a mummy in John. You got to pick one of them. So, by the way, those zombies in Matthew is at the crucifixion when Jesus. Well, the story of the crucifixion. Jesus is raised. It says all the dead were raised. But anyway, I couldn't help myself for Halloween, so I am preaching on John chapter 11. We're going to read verses 1 to 46. So if you want to open up your Bibles to that. The name of this sermon is The Invitation to Life. And I'll get in more about that when we get into the story. But it's interesting, I think some of the ways that we often think about this story and what is happening with the resurrection, the resuscitation of Lazarus, is not exactly what we think it is. And so I think there's a lot more going on here than we think, and it's a lot more involved and I think a deeper, greater story. So John chapter 11, we're going to start at verse 1 and we're going to read 46 verses. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Those two sentences next to each other are the craziest juxtaposition ever, but I'll get into that. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. And after saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Oh, silly disciples. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Jesus is saying all kinds of crazy cryptic things. So Thomas, called the twin, said to the fellow disciples, Let us also go that we may die with him. There's so much in this. So now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Sounds familiar. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone, Martha. The sister of the dead man said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come on out. The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he had did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. May God add his blessing to the reading of this, his word, and teach us from it today. Okay, so there's a lot there. And I really couldn't pull out a single section of this to talk about because it's one cohesive story. So I have 5 points, and don't worry, I'll tell you what they are as I get to them. But for those of you taking notes, it's only 5 points, and I will tell you what they are so you can write those down. What I find most interesting about this story is the amount of time Jesus spends telling people that this miracle is so they will believe. And I say that up front here because that was the whole reason I thought about this story this week. We've had so much going on in our life as a church the last couple of weeks. And I wonder how equipped we are as a community to understand communal grief and communal help and communal support. And this story, Jesus is focusing on the community of people. So, verses 1 to 6, I'll read those real quick. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village Mary and his sister Martha. Verse 2 here, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. What's interesting about that is John hasn't actually talked about that story yet. So that story comes later, and yet John is telling us who this person is based upon a story that we're supposed to have known from reading the other Gospels. And so that's an important thing to remember, that John, in writing this Gospel, everyone believes that he was the last one to write the Gospel. And so there's some indications of that, but that's going to come up again when we talk about Jesus calling Lazarus to come out and why that's an important piece. But I just want to point out here that this verse 2, is John pointing to a story that he'll tell later, knowing that we should know it from the other Gospels. Okay? And so the sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And Jesus says this illness does not lead to death, but it's for the glory of God. And verses 5 and 6, this is crazy. So now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So John tells us that Jesus loved them. And then John says, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days. Okay, when I read that, I go, that's not love. Right? I think John's setting it up to say, now Jesus loved them, and the next verse should be, so he went immediately to them. Right? Like that's what I think should be happening. And yet John says, no, he loved them, so he stayed. And as we'll see from verses 1 to 16, my first point is this: God's ways are not our ways. See, throughout this story, everyone's trying to tell Jesus what he should do. And Jesus' response is always, you don't understand, I'm doing this for you. How often do things happen and we go to God and we go to Jesus and we say, God, you need to do it this way? How often do things happen and we think, God, if you loved me, you would do X? Right? And yet here John says, because Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, he delays. Because he loves them. That is something that at the time I would not be able to understand. I only understand it because I have the whole story here in front of me, and I see what Jesus is doing, and I see the miracle that is to come. And because I know the future of what's happening in the story, I am able to say, yeah, no, I get why Jesus is staying, because he loves them, because he wants to show them his power. And so God's ways are not our ways, often because we don't understand the story that's coming. And so if we read verses 7 to 17, we find that the disciples don't think he should go back to Judea because they're going to stone him and they're going to kill him and they want him dead. And what's funny about that is that Jesus is going to do this public miracle because he wants to give the Pharisees a reason to kill him. Because he knows that without his own death and resurrection, Lazarus' death and resuscitation can never happen. That the forgiveness of the world, that the blessings that he came to give cannot happen without his own death. And so it is funny that the disciples say to him, if you go, you will die, because that's the whole reason he's going. And then he says cryptic things, because Jesus always says cryptic things, and God says cryptic things, and it drives me nutty. But he says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the daylight, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. And I'm like, yeah, duh, Jesus. Like, yeah, the sun's out. I can see where I'm going. Of course, I'm not going to fall. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles. Well, yeah, because it's dark. Because the light is not in him. Well, wait, what? Right? That last part, because the light is not in him, is the part that's confusing. The rest of it, you're just like, Jesus, you're saying things that everybody knows. But John's gospel, if you go all the way back to John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the light of the world came into the world, but the world did not know him. Light and darkness is a major theme for John. That Jesus brings light to the darkness. For John, light is life. And so for Jesus to talk about light and darkness here, he is foreshadowing not only Lazarus coming back from the dead, but also his own death and resurrection. And that's why he says, because the light is not in him, because Jesus is the light. Because we are followers of Jesus. And so yet again, Jesus says something cryptic that nobody understands, because God's ways are not our ways. And he goes even further. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. And they're like, well, then he'll wake up, Jesus. And he's like, all right, fine. Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there. Wait, what? So that you may believe. But let us go to him. God's ways are not our ways. Jesus delays so that a public miracle can happen. And even the disciples who are walking with him can believe who he is. These 12 men who have spent days and weeks and months and years with Jesus need this miracle as much as the people they're mourning to understand who Jesus is. And so Jesus, because he loves them and wants them to understand who he is, delays. And then Thomas says something that I don't think even Thomas understood what he was saying. Thomas says, well, then let us go also, that we may die with him. And if you know anything about church history, nearly every disciple is martyred for Jesus. And so now we get to verses 17 to 27. And it is in verse 17 that we find that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So Jesus waits 2 days and he shows up 4 days. So he shows up at the tomb 4 days after Lazarus died, and he waited 2 days, and we find out later in the story that Lazarus, it was possible, maybe, that Jesus could have come in time before Lazarus died. And that's important, because as we see in verse 20, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, because, of course, Martha, the one who's always doing, always acting, always doing things, she runs out and she says, Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Don't you know, Jesus? Don't you love me, Jesus? If only you had been here, my brother would not have died. God, if only you had given me that money, I wouldn't have been evicted. God, if only you had provided me with that job, I wouldn't be in the situation that I am. If only. Martha seeks to change the past to make her present better. Sorry, for you guys it would be, no, this is the past for you guys. Martha seeks to change the past so that her present might be better. And we are all this way. We look behind us and wish that the past was better so that our present would be better. We are so stuck in the things that happened that we aren't looking to the things that will happen. And Martha comes to Jesus and says, if you had been here. But then Jesus takes Martha out of the past, he takes Martha out of the present, and he points her to the future. And he says, your brother will rise again. And Martha knows what Jesus is talking about. At the time of this story, most Jews, maybe not the Sadducees, but most Jews believed that at the end of time, all who believed in God would be raised again, right? So the Sadducees didn't believe that, but basically everybody else did. And so Jesus says, your brother will be raised, talking about the future. But Martha says, I know that he will raise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says to her, Martha, you don't understand. Martha, you don't know what I'm doing. Martha, you can't understand what I'm doing because you haven't seen what it is. Martha, I love you, and this is why I waited, so that you would know who I am, because he says this, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And Martha says she does, but I don't know if she even knows whether she believes that or not, because she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who's coming into the world, right? So she gives him a stock answer that she knows because she's heard him talk about stuff and she knows things about him. But here's point number 2. God makes the future hope a present reality. See, the raising of Lazarus back to life is only possible because of the future hope of the resurrection of all the dead who are in Christ Jesus. And so it is that future hope that breaks into our present, that enables Jesus to say to Martha, your brother is not dead. Because the future hope comes back into the present. Well, we are stuck in the past. God is drawing us to the future. Because God's ways are not our ways. Because God makes the future hope, the present reality. Jesus is doing this miracle because he wants people to understand who he is, what he's going to do. And he is only able to do this miracle because of what is to come. So all the commentaries I read on this all speak of how this story is a parallel to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And they focus so much on that I think they missed something. But I mean, I can't blame them for focusing on Jesus. But I want to point out that they are right. Jesus is only able to do this miracle because of his coming death and resurrection. It is the power of the resurrection that enables him to raise Lazarus from the dead, even though Jesus hasn't died yet. See how the future reality, future promise becomes the present reality? God does weird, wibbly, wobbly, timey-wimey things. If you've ever seen Doctor Who, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Because of the power of God, he can make the future hope a present reality. And so now we get to verses 28 to 37. This section has my favorite Bible verse because it's the easiest Bible verse to remember. I used to just quote John 11:35a to people, Jesus. But that verse is such a powerful verse. So we'll get to that in just a second. So in verses 28 to 33, we see something that is probably foreign to us. In verse 29 or in verse 30 we have, now Jesus had not yet come into the village. 31. When the Jews who were with Mary in her house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now, I don't know if you know anything about like Middle Eastern funerals or some kind of, sometimes in Africa, and I think probably even in South America funerals, basically anywhere that's not the Western world. There are people who are paid to be mourners. So you have a funeral and you pay someone to make a scene. And they come and they go, ah! And they're wailing and they're screaming and they're making a noise. And so Mary gets up and leaves, and these people who are with her, now, not necessarily all of them were paid to be there, and I don't know if they were, but there was this understanding in that culture that you would go with them, that you would mourn with them, that mourning was not an individual thing. It is a corporate. And in fact, one of the commentaries I read talked about how sadness is contagious. And I see this all the time working as a chaplain. Because oftentimes, when I'm there at end of life, people see the death in front of them and have what seems like outsized reactions to it. But the reality of that is they're not crying over just that death. They're crying over all the previous deaths in their life. And so in the Western world, we don't necessarily deal with our stuff. And so when someone else is in mourning, we avoid them because we know if I go to them, I'm going to catch their sadness, and all the junk that I haven't dealt with yet, that's going to come out and play. That's going to play out here. And yet in this culture, they welcome that. And in fact, in some places, I think in South America, they have these long funeral processions that go through the town, and everyone in the town, whether they know the dead person or not, comes out and cries with the family as they're going from the home to the grave. There is this long procession. And so we see here in verses 28 to 33 this understanding of weeping and mourning. It is a corporate thing. There are many people around, and in fact, this is exactly the reason why Jesus waited. Jesus knew there would be a gathering days after the funeral, if you will, there is still people mourning with Mary and Martha. And so she comes to Jesus, and she says, I think it's word for word. Let me double check. So Martha in verse 21 says, Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Mary in verse 32 says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. They say literally the same thing, and I didn't do my homework. I didn't look this up in the Greek to see if the Greek is word for word literally the same thing, but I would bet $100 it is. They have the same question of Jesus. As we saw previously, the if only should really be an if Jesus. But the focus here that I want to focus on is in verse 35. I'm going to come back to verse 34 because there's an interesting thing going on there. But in verse 35, it says Jesus wept. I cannot tell you the number of pages of commentaries that have been written trying to understand two words. And there's all these arguments about why did Jesus cry? Is he crying because he's sad? Is he crying because the people don't understand that Jesus, he's not weeping for Lazarus, he's weeping for their lack of faith. He's not like all of this. Jesus cried because Lazarus was his friend. Jesus cried because sadness is contagious. Jesus cried because our God understands our pain. Number 3, God understands our suffering because of the incarnation. Jesus was fully human. These commentaries are forgetting that. They're focusing on the godness of Jesus and not the humanness of Jesus. Jesus was a human being who had friends, and his friend was dead. Yeah, he knew his friend was gonna come back to life. That doesn't make the suffering any less. Yes, we know that our loved ones who die, when we come to that funeral, we know that we will see them again, but that doesn't change the fact that they aren't with us right now. And so if our God who we serve can weep for a friend who will be raised in minutes, how dare we tell people that they can't cry for their family who they won't see for years? God understands our suffering because of the incarnation. Jesus cries because he understands. Jesus cries because he feels what we feel. Jesus cries because there was a whole thing where Jesus says it's moved in his being, and if you look at the Greek, it's almost like he's angry, and the best understanding of that I said is Jesus is angry at death. He is so moved by the suffering that death causes that it makes him angry and sad at the same time. He is angry that death is a thing, and he is sad at the consequences of it. And in fact, we see this very same thing in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see this very same thing when he hangs on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. He is angry at the consequences of sin. He's angry at sin, and he is sad that the consequences of sin affect us. We see in this verse the wrath of God and the love of God. God is angry that sin is a thing, and he is saddened that it affects humans so. And here in verse 36, verse 37, we see a prefigurement of the mocking that Jesus will have on the cross. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Previously in John, there's this whole story about a man born blind. And the disciples say, Jesus, why was he born blind? And what does Jesus say? He was born blind for the glory of God. Similar to why Jesus is delaying so that the glory of God may be revealed. I think it's interesting that John picks up on this here. And yet this prefigures the mocking that Jesus will have. Jesus, if you are the King of the Jews, bring yourself down from that cross. They don't understand that this miracle exists because of the crucifixion. They don't understand that Jesus is doing something different here. It is questions like this and statements from Jesus about, I am doing this for you, that make me realize that there is a very important reason why Jesus didn't just say, when he heard that Lazarus was dead, Lazarus be healed. We know Jesus can do that. The centurion comes to him and says, Lord, if you just say the word, my servant will be healed. And Jesus says he is healed. And at that very moment, we are told, the servant was healed. So it's not like Jesus had to be there to raise Lazarus from the dead. Jesus could have said something and Lazarus would be raised. But Jesus is doing something here. He is drawing a community around Lazarus. He is delaying so that there will be a community. He is delaying so that there will be a very public miracle that will give the Pharisees and the Sadducees reason to kill him. And that will display the fact that he is God to the world. And now we get to my favorite part. So verses 38 to 46. I have 2 points for this section. Verse 39. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And I'm going to get back to that take away the stone comment. But Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Martha, who previously said, "Lord, I know you're the Messiah who's come to raise my brother to life," doesn't believe. "Lord, if we move that stone, he's going to stink." Now, I wouldn't know what that's like right now because I can't smell anything. But, "Lord, if we move the stone, he's been dead for 4 days. Don't you know what happens to a body when it dies, God? Don't you know that this is the way that things are supposed to be? I mean, you set this up, right? You created the world. You created decay. Don't you know that decay means smell?" Verse 40, Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" He doesn't answer her question. He doesn't say, no, he's not going to smell. And in fact, John doesn't tell us whether or not he smelled or not. Now, most commentators say the assumption is that there was no smell. But the point is, Martha is calling into question the miracle at the tomb. Jesus says, "Take the stone away." He is there to do what she asked him to do. She said, "God, raise my brother." And God goes to do it. And she says, "God, don't raise my brother." Like, how often do we do this to God? We say, "God, I want you to do this thing." Wait, not that way. "God, I want you to provide for me a new home, not by taking away my old one." God, what are you thinking? So he tells them to take the stone away. He tells Martha, "Martha, if you believed." And then, after they move the stone away, Jesus looks up to the sky and says this, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around." Remember, there's a crowd because it's a funeral? "That they may believe that you sent me." Jesus, we aren't given the actual prayers that Jesus has been praying. I read one commentator who said the 2 days that Jesus delayed was Jesus praying for Lazarus. Maybe. I don't necessarily buy that. But what I will say is Jesus has been praying about this, and all we're given here is that he is saying out loud to the people that God has answered his prayers. that they may believe in the Father and in Jesus and in the Father who sent him. And so verse 43, when he said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come here. Now, I say it that way because often we say, when he said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! I don't think that's actually what happened. I think it was a loud voice because there's a bunch of people crying. But this is the crazy thing. I'm going to go into some Greek. I know it's going to be a little hard, but it's important. Okay, so when Jesus says Lazarus come out, the word come there, to come, is a Greek word called dero. Dero. Delta, epsilon, whatever the U is, I can't remember, rho, omega. D-E-U-R-O. Dero. It is the one of 3 times that John uses this word. Previously, in verse 34, when Jesus said, where have you laid him? And Mary says, Lord, come and see. That word for to come is the one that John uses all over the gospel. And it's erchomai. E-R-X-O-M-A-I. Erchomai, specifically in the Gospel of John, is used of God coming to man, of the Godhead of Jesus, it speaks to the messiahship of who Jesus is. The word that John uses here, the only other places that John uses that word in his gospel, are the woman at the well who says, come and see the man who told me who I am. And when Jesus is raised and sees the disciples running, or sees the disciples fishing and says, come and have breakfast with me. In Matthew's gospel, this word gets used when Jesus says to the disciples, come, I will make you fishers of men. In Revelation, which was written by John, this word is used when the angel says to John, come, let me show you these things. This word is an invitation. Hence the name, invitation to life. This is not Jesus commanding Lazarus to come out of the tomb. This is Jesus inviting Lazarus into life. He's saying it in a loud voice because everybody's crying. But he's inviting Lazarus. And so what that means is that Lazarus had a choice. Lazarus could have chose to stay in the tomb. In fact, we find later that when Lazarus comes out, he is still bound up. This is why he's a mummy, right? But when Lazarus comes, he probably actually was more like this. But anyway, he had a choice. So point 4, God invites us to be healed. Lazarus could have said, you know what? Not Jesus. I'm going to stay here in my stink. I'm going to stay here in my binding up because I don't want them to see me like that. There's a crowd of people out there, God. Don't you know that they're going to see how sinful I am, God? God, don't you know that they're going to see my stench? They're going to smell me, God, and they're going to judge me. They're going to judge me, God, so I'm staying here in my tomb. I'm staying dead, because if I come out to life like this, God, then I don't know what's going to happen. And so I would rather stay dead than risk people seeing my flaws, than risk people seeing that I don't have it all together. See, the way Lazarus was wrapped up, there was no way he could have unwrapped himself. So for him to actually come out meant that he would have to seek help from someone else. And that is, in fact, my next point. Point 5. God uses the community to facilitate our healing. See, He says, Lazarus, come out. And then it says, Lazarus chose. He chose to come out. He says, the man who had died came out, but his hands and feet were bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. And in fact, if we go back to verse 39, Jesus commands them to take the stone away. God uses the community to facilitate our healing. Lazarus can't come out of the tomb unless the community rolls the stone away. Lazarus can't be unbound unless the community unbinds him. The community that is gathered to weep with Mary and Martha is the very same community that is there to provide the way for Lazarus to be raised, to provide the way for Lazarus to be reintegrated into society. And so are we, unlike Lazarus, afraid to come out of the tomb? And on the flip side, do we, as a community, keep people bound? See, the community had a choice too. They didn't have to roll the stone away. In fact, Mary says, don't you know he's going to stink? And the community doesn't have to unbind him. Communities can free people by walking with them and living life with them, or communities can keep people bound. Communities can say things like, you must live this way. You have to come to my service meal. You can't do that on the Sabbath. God can't use you because you're too young, or you're too old, or you're too new, or you're too different. We, as a community, have the power to keep people bound. In this whole story, Jesus was concerned about the community because it is the community that embodies him on earth. This miracle was a prefiguring of his crucifixion and a reason for his death. But it also was a lesson in how the church is enabled by God to bring healing to the world. There is a community around each and every one of us. That community cannot know our suffering if we don't come out of the tomb. And some of us are afraid to come out of the tomb because we've peeked our heads out before and been told, you've got to unwrap yourself before you come out, son. You can't come out like that. What do you think you're doing? Don't you know this is a church? How dare you say that here? How dare you think that? How dare you do these things? Don't you know this is a holy place and you are not holy? Yeah, neither are you. I desire for a community that is welcoming of people who come out stinky and bound. I know that my God will not leave that person that way. And I know that my God is the one that enabled them to even come out. And so as a community, when God says, accept these people, love these people, work with these people, I know that my job as the church is to unbind them, is to wash them, is to walk with them and show them what it means to live this new life. In the movie The Matrix, Neo wakes up. He's freed from the Matrix. He takes the red pill and he goes down the rabbit hole. And the first time he wakes up, he asks, why do my eyes hurt? And they say, because you've never used them before. We, as a community, are those that are using our eyes. And we are constantly having people going, why do my eyes hurt? And it is our job to show them with compassion and love, because you've never used them before. Let me show you what it means to live. Not as a community to go, how dare you complain about your eyes being hurt? I don't want to hear about it. My eyes hurt when I came out. Maybe today you aren't sure what God is doing. But that's okay, because his ways are greater than you can imagine. And maybe today you wish the past was different because it would help the present. But take heart, God can bring the future healing to you now. Maybe today you feel like no one understands your suffering. Our God has been where you are. He understands your pain and has felt your loss. Maybe today you smell the stink of your sin. God is inviting you into healing. You don't have to come, but you can. Maybe today you feel trapped and stinking. That's okay. God will not force you to change, but he does invite you to follow him. And maybe today you smell the stink of someone else's sin. God is inviting you into their healing. You can help or you can hinder. Which will you choose? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you that you are a gracious and loving God. Lord, I thank you that you have chosen to use the community around us to bring us healing. Father, I thank you that you invite me into life. God, I pray that you would show us, that you would give us eyes to see others the way that you do, that we might unbind those in our community. Father, I pray that we would be unbound in our own selves. Lord, I pray that we as a nation would be united. God, I pray that we as Christians would speak peace and love and unity above division and hate. Father, thank you. Jesus, thank you that your death and resurrection means that my future hope can trickle into my present and I can have a glimpse of heaven here on earth. Amen.